Good afternoon, and welcome back to another episode of The League of Biblical Enthusiasts. So, last week we discussed the early life and academic career of Constantine Tischendorf and the cultural and religious climate he faced. In the early 19th century, there was growing skepticism from scholarly circles about the historicity of the events described in the New Testament and the trustworthiness of the New Testament text itself. Tischendorf's life quest stemmed from an apologetic motive that drove him to search for the earliest Greek manuscripts of the New Testament. He believed that there were still treasures to be found in the libraries and monasteries in the Middle East, particularly. His goal was to set the text of the Greek New Testament on a firmer basis by acquiring the oldest manuscripts possible and thereby hoping to create more confidence in the story of the scriptures. This quest led him to many foreign countries, scouring old churches, dusty libraries, and ancient monasteries. His trips abroad from 1840 to 1845 yielded many important manuscript finds, but none was as precious as his most important discovery, Codex Sinaiticus. In this episode, we recount how he found it and its significance for New Testament textual studies. In 1839, Tischendorf went on research trips to libraries in southern Germany and Switzerland, and by doing so, he postponed his marriage to his fiancée Angelica for 5 years, thus showing his great interest in these manuscripts. He also visited Paris, where over the course of 2 years he deciphered Codex Ephraimi and published his findings for all the scholarly world to see. We forget how difficult his mission was. Today, we can see ancient manuscripts up close and personal online, in the comfort of your own home, with a cup of coffee in your hand, never setting a foot outside. Not so in Tischendorf's day. He traveled to, for him, strange countries with strange customs, strange languages, meeting strangers he hoped would welcome him into the libraries. It was not always so easy. He would travel thousands of miles under challenging conditions, facing thunderstorms and often in the deserts under a stifling hot sun for hours, on camelback, sleeping at night in tents, all under the watch of his Bedouin hosts. During his time in Paris, he toured Holland and England and worked in the libraries of London, Cambridge, and Oxford. When he finished his work in Paris, he visited Basel, Bern, Geneva, Lyon, Avignon, and Marseille. And another year of research followed in the libraries of Italy, especially those in Rome, Naples, Florence, Venice, Modena, Verona, and Milan. But he especially wanted to visit the monastic libraries in the Middle East, where the Bible originated. So in May of 1844, he departed from Leghorn, Italy, today it's called Livorno, and traveled by steamer to Egypt. In addition to the Coptic monasteries in the Libyan desert and the libraries of Alexandria and Cairo, he wanted at all costs to visit St. Catherine's Monastery in the Sinai. St. Catherine's is the oldest continuously inhabited monastery on the planet, with its beginnings during Emperor Justinian's reign around 550 AD. Its reputation was already legendary, and others had visited it before with enticing reports of its large library of ancient manuscripts. So after 2 weeks of dangerous desert travel, starting from Cairo, he reached the secluded monastery in southern Sinai with a small caravan in May of 1844. He described seeing the monastery for the first time, and I quote, "I did not see the monastery until we were close upon it. It lies in a long, narrow valley. The monastery itself has the appearance of a small fortress from the elevation of its walls, which are 40 feet high, and the want of an especial entrance strengthened this impression. The door is 30 feet high, to reach which it is necessary to be wound up by a rope. Several Bedouins were grouped upon my arrival beneath the door. They did not omit announcing my appearance by loud cries and firing arms. Before I was permitted to ascend, I was required to show my letters. The 2 letters from Suez which I tendered were immediately drawn up. How striking it is in the midst of the barren desert, cheerless with its sand and rock, suddenly to abide within these hospital walls, in these well-arranged and ornamental pleasure grounds and chambers, surrounded by men of serious aspect, with long beards and black gowns. And so, Tischendorf was welcomed to the monastery and given accommodations for his brief stay. He quickly made friends with a librarian named Kyrillos. Tischendorf describes in his own words how it was he first discovered the manuscript we now know as Codex Sinaiticus. And he says, "It was at the foot of Mount Sinai in the convent of St. Catherine that I discovered the pearl of all my researches. In visiting the monastery in the month of May 1844, I perceived in the middle a great hall and a large and wide basket full of old parchments. And the librarian was a man of information, and he told me that 2 heaps of papers like these, moldered by time, had already been committed to the flames. What was my surprise to find amid this heap of papers a considerable number of sheets of a copy of the Old Testament in Greek, which seemed to me to be one of the most ancient that I had ever seen. The authorities of the monastery allowed me to possess myself of a third of these parchments, or about 43 sheets, all the more readily as they were designated for the fire. But I could not get them to yield up possession of the remainder. The too lively satisfaction which I had displayed had aroused their suspicion as to the value of the manuscript. I transcribed a page of the text of Isaiah and Jeremiah and enjoined on the monks to take religious care of all such remains which might fall their way." Now, these 43 sheets were from the Old Testament. 86 sheets from the same manuscript were left behind in the monastery. The abbot of the monastery refused to let Tischendorf have them. So he soon departed with his 43 leaves and returned to Cairo. And this is his account of his first of 3 trips to St. Catherine's. Some have disputed his story about the manuscripts being rescued from the fire. So more about that later. By January 1845, Tischendorf was back in Leipzig with his 43 leaves. In return for the expenses of his travels, he gave all that he had discovered to King Frederick Augustus II of Saxony. And in 1846, he published his edition of the 43 parchments under the title Codex Frederico Augustinus. In this work, he simply described the provenance of the manuscripts as being, quote, "from the East," unquote. In his 1849 travel diary, Travels in the East, he told of his visit to St. Catherine's without mention of this discovery. He kept the location of his finds a secret because he intended to visit St. Catherine's again to try to secure the rest of the manuscript. And by 1853, he was back at St. Catherine's in search of the rest of the parchments. This time, however, he was sorely disappointed, and the monks could not or would not produce the rest of those 86 leaves he saw and left behind on the first trip. But ever undaunted, he planned to return to St. Catherine's yet a 3rd time. In preparing for his 3rd and final trip, he secured the financial backing from the most powerful figure in Orthodox Christianity, that being the Tsar of Russia, Tsar Alexander II. He promised that he would turn over to the Tsar everything he discovered on this 3rd trip. So in January 1859, he set sail again for Egypt, which would be his final visit to the monastery. While at the monastery, he was allowed to rummage again through the library in search of more manuscripts. Unfortunately, he did not find the precious 86 leaves he so desperately hoped for. And on February the 4th, he told his Bedouin guides to prepare to leave for Cairo in 3 days. And that evening, he took a walk with the young steward of the monastery, and then afterwards went for some refreshment in the steward's cell. The steward remarked that he too had read the Greek version of the Old Testament. He stepped over to the corner of his cell, took down a bulky book wrapped in red cloth, and laid it before Tischendorf. Tischendorf was allowed to take it to his room and study it. It contained not only the 86 leaves left behind, but 346 leaves in the same handwriting from the same document. He had just been delivered the volume of his dreams, the Greek Old and New Testament from the early 4th century to mid-4th century, the oldest complete Bible in existence. He wrote to his wife Angelica about his discovery in a letter from Cairo on February 15, 1859. He said, "I had hoped to give a victory bulletin. Now truly the Lord has decreed that it would be one. He has already given such great blessing to my research in its first steps that only tears of emotion in response. I had always said it. I go in the name of the Lord in search for treasures that will bear fruit for his church. Now I know it, and I was honestly shocked by the truth myself. The entire manuscript, as it is now, is an incomparable gem for science and the church." Almost immediately, Tischendorf asked permission to take the manuscript to the sister monastery in Cairo to be copied, but he was refused. So he raced back to Cairo to appeal to the abbot there. That abbot gave him permission for the manuscript to be brought to Cairo and to be copied. Then Tischendorf suggested to the monks that the manuscript be allowed to be donated to the Russian Tsar for safekeeping and preservation. But only the archbishop could grant such a request. And at the time, there was no sitting archbishop, since there was an election for a new one taking place in Constantinople, and the process was not going very well. Here's where the story gets complicated. The favorite candidate for the new archbishop was Cyril, but the Patriarch of Jerusalem opposed him. So Tischendorf used the Tsar's influence to get Cyril installed, with the understanding that Cyril would agree to gift the manuscript once he was securely in his office. Cyril was installed, but later insisted he had never given the manuscript away, but only had lent it to the Russians. Nonetheless, Tischendorf was in possession of the manuscript and presented it to the Russian royalty on November 19, 1859. In the meantime, the Russian government was negotiating a deal between successive archbishops. It was not until 2005 that documents from the Russian archives came to light to provide new information on this story. Several documents now in the Russian archives reveal that the monks of St. Catherine's encouraged the Russians to support a new archbishop, Callistratus, in exchange for giving the Codex to the Tsar for 9,000 rubles. Callistratus did become archbishop, and the Codex was now the Russians' property. To this day, some still dispute that the monks voluntarily donated the manuscripts to Tischendorf. For example, James Bentley and James Charlesworth regard Tischendorf as a thief and believe that he, with the help of the Russians, forced the archbishop to relinquish it under undue pressure. Now, I'm passing over the story of Constantine Simonides, who was a pseudo-scholar who claimed he had written and forged the Codex in 1840 to give to the Tsar as a present. His claim has been judged false, but it's only served to increase interest in the Codex. Links to this side story and other resources will be left in the description for your review. Others also dispute Tischendorf's claim that his initial discovery of those 43 leaves was a rescue effort that kept them from being burned as trash. There is so much more to this story that we cannot recount here, but links to the relevant sources are left in the description. To make a long story short, by the summer of 1933, it had become known that the Soviet government of Joseph Stalin wished to raise foreign capital, and this to support the second five-year plan by selling the Codex through the London booksellers Maggs Brothers. In 1933, the Russian government sold the Codex to the British Library for a sum of £100,000, which today is equivalent in excess of £5 million. The museum would contribute £7,000, and the public would contribute donations to complete the rest of the purchase. Donations came pouring in, not only from the British, but American institutions and individuals as well. The Codex was shipped by special courier over Christmas weekend 1933 and reached Britain on Boxing Day, the day after Christmas. On December 27th, 15 minutes past noon, and with the police escort, Ernest Maggs walked into the museum carrying the manuscript in a tin box wrapped in brown paper. 3,000 people turned up early at the museum to see it. Now, where is the manuscript to be found today? Well, today the surviving portions of the Codex Sinaiticus are dispersed across 4 main locations. Number 1, the 43 pages Tischendorf initially acquired are in the University Library in Leipzig, Germany. Second, the largest portion of the Codex is held at the British Library, which holds 347 leaves of the manuscript, making it the most substantial portion of the surviving Codex. I was fortunate to view it in 2018, and it is awe-inspiring indeed. Number 3, St. Catherine's Monastery possesses 12 leaves and fragments that were newly discovered in 1975. And fourth, a few fragments remain in the Russian National Library in St. Petersburg. In 2008, these 4 partners linked their images together and launched the Codex Sinaiticus website, which brought together digital images of the surviving parts of the Codex. And the Codex can now be viewed in its entirety online. The link to it will be in the description box. Well, so much more can be told, but we must stop here. I am, in fact, thinking about a 3rd episode of the Tischendorf story, which provides details on the manuscript itself. For example, what does the manuscript contain? Is it missing anything? What surprises are in the text? Hint, many. And how do scholars regard the significance of the Codex today? So many questions, so little time. Well, I hope you have enjoyed this short episode, and if you have, please like and subscribe and share with others. We will see you in a week or so. Thanks for listening to The League of Biblical Enthusiasts, and we'll see you next time.